History of Poland, Episode 14, Władysław's Family Troubles. Hello and welcome back. Last time, we left off with Bolesław II being kicked out of Poland after murdering the Bishop of Krakow. In his absence, his brother Władysław has taken up the throne. Now, you may be thinking to yourself that this is nothing out of the ordinary for the tumultuous Piast dynasty. After all, one royal family member gets kicked out and the next one steps in. Yet, in many ways, this is not an ordinary succession. Instead, as we'll find out in this episode and ones to come, if there's one thing that defines Władysław's reign, it's the unclear order of succession. The problem starts with Bolesław II's son, Mieszko. Yes, Bolesław had a son, and yes, according to the standard practice of the day, Mieszko would have been in line to inherit his father's land, titles, privileges, etc. I say this even though Bolesław II had been deposed, as there's no record that he abdicated in favor of his brother, which would normally have meant that Mieszko would have taken up his place as ruler. Unfortunately, we know what happened instead. Władysław began to reign, with Mieszko in self-imposed exile in Hungary, possibly with his father by his side. Unlike his brother, Władysław reigned not as the King of Poland, but instead as the Duke of Poland, which pretty much sets the tone for his entire reign. Whereas the role of king would have involved centralizing power, standing up to foreign powers, and cowing nobles, the role of duke was more of a middle manager sort of role. By making it clear that he was not aspiring to just pick up his brother's crown, Władysław would have been signaling to both domestic and foreign power brokers that he was looking to turn over a new leaf and not ruffle any feathers. Who was he signaling this submissiveness to, you ask? Two answers: the Empire and Bohemia. In doing this, Władysław was again striking a course counter to that of his brother. At this time, the investiture controversy was ongoing, meaning that to be in favor of the Pope was to be against the Emperor, and to be in favor of the Emperor was to be against the Pope. As such, Bolesław was decidedly anti-imperial, while Władysław would be decidedly pro-imperial and anti-Pope. Władysław's pivot to the Empire started in the year 1080 with his marriage to Judith of Bohemia, the daughter of Władysław II of Bohemia, the Duke of Bohemia. This was not Władysław's first relationship, as the conventional telling goes that he was either previously married or that he had a mistress. Either way, he had a son named Zbigniew. There isn't a ton of information available about Judith of Bohemia, and what we do have comes from Gallus Anonymous, which is partially problematic. Gallus tells us that Judith was, quote, a woman who had always performed acts of charity towards the poor and those in captivity, especially preceding the day of her death. End quote. While that does sound nice, it's worth taking a moment to examine Gallus Anonymous once again as a chronicler and amateur historian. As we've mentioned in the past, and of course as you can probably pick up from his nickname, Gallus was an anonymous writer. The name Gallus refers either to an Irish or French origin, and historians believe he was a traveling monk who spent time in Eastern Europe chronicling the history of the areas he visited. The stories he's been giving us up until this point about Polish history have of course been informed by his position as a foreigner, especially as the sources for his chronicle would have been locals with their own agendas to push. We've been able to avoid much of this bias so far, but we're about to enter a whole new world of potential biases. You see, the whole point of Gallus's history of the nation has been to paint the backstory for Bolesław III, the son of Władysław and Judith. Gallus was writing in the first few decades of the 12th century, a time in which Bolesław III was the most powerful person in Poland. So, when we read that Gallus goes into great detail praising Bolesław's bravely fighting boars and bears, he really goes into a lot of detail about this, it's not to say that those things didn't happen, but that he's putting a very rosy picture on it. He's likely writing about Bolesław in flattering terms so that he isn't seen as a meddling foreigner. After all, you don't want to go around criticizing the mother of the most powerful person in the land, you don't want to besmirch the ruling family's ancestors, and you most certainly do want to paint them in a good light. This seems to be the consensus of historians, and is reinforced by both Paul Knoll and Frank Scher, the translators of The Deeds of the Princess of the Poles, in their notes on Gallus's work. With that incredibly long-winded disclaimer out of the way, what should we be thinking about when we read Gallus's description of events that were happening right in front of him? First, we should be aware that Gallus is telling things as if they all favored the powers that be. Second, it's unlikely he's inventing things out of whole cloth, as that would be difficult to pull off. Third, as a foreigner, he is forced to rely on the accounts of locals, who may be feeding him stories that benefit their desires and political goals. In short, we shouldn't ignore Gallus, but we should likewise avoid giving him the benefit of the doubt. Back to our story. Władysław is moving to get closer to Bohemia and the Empire via marriage. This closeness does appear to be happening, but not necessarily to the benefit of Poland. This is because, in the year 1085, Władysław's father-in-law, Władysław of Bohemia, was given the title King of Bohemia and Poland by Emperor Henry IV. While this kingship was non-hereditary, meaning that it wouldn't pass to Władysław's descendants upon his death, you have to imagine that it stung a bit in Poland that there was someone out there calling themselves the King of Poland who wasn't even Polish. Of course, this title was just that, a title. It didn't ensure any loyalty from the Polish nobility, it didn't mean Władysław was now in charge of Poland, it just meant that he had a nice-sounding title as a reward for helping out the emperor in battle. That being said, while Władysław continued to rule Poland, he did it as a vassal of Władysław, meaning that he owed him his allegiance and resumed the practice of paying tribute to Bohemia for the region of Silesia, a practice that had been temporarily put to a stop by his predecessors. Władysław's reign continued to be one of appeasing whoever demanded something of him, both domestically and in foreign affairs, which we see again in 1085 when some Polish nobles demanded that Władysław bring back his nephew Mieszko, who, as we mentioned, had been in exile in Hungary during the first years of his reign. Mieszko agreed to come back, but only on the condition that he be placed as first in the line of succession on the death of Władysław. This wasn't much of a problem, since at this point Władysław only had one son, who was illegitimate, so Władysław agreed to the terms and Mieszko came back to Poland, seemingly much beloved by the people. Unfortunately for Mieszko, Władysław and Judith of Bohemia gave birth to a son named Bolesław shortly after Mieszko returned, meaning that Mieszko was now first in line for succession, ahead of both the legitimate and illegitimate sons of Władysław. It should come as no surprise that Mieszko did not live long after the birth of Bolesław. As Gallus tells us, quote, "For King Władysław of Hungary had been looking after the boy after his father died, and for his father's sake treated him as if he were his own son. Certainly, none of the Polish and Hungarian friends of his own age could match him in honest character and good looks, and by these evident signs he drew everybody's attention to him with good hope for his future role. For this reason, his uncle Duke Władysław made an ill-omened decision to call the boy back to Poland, and to marry him, in spite of fate's envy, to a girl from Russia. So the young man was married before his beard had grown, a handsome lad who was so well-bred and so wise and so followed his forefathers' ancient ways that he was held in marvelous affection by the entire country. But fortune, ever hostile to mortal happiness, turned their joy to sorrow, and cut off the hopes of his worth in the flower of his youth. They say it was certain jealous persons who feared that he would take revenge for the wrongs done to his father, who did away with this boy of fine promise by poison. Indeed, some of those who were drinking with him barely escaped death themselves. The death of the boy Mieszko threw the whole of Poland into mourning like a mother mourning for her only son. Not only did those who knew him lament, but even those who had never set eyes on him followed the dead boy's bier with lamentation. The peasants left their plows, the shepherds their flocks, the craftsmen neglected their workshops, the workmen their work for grief at the death of Mieszko. Young girls and boys, even servants and maids, attended Mieszko's funeral with tears and groans. At the last, his poor mother, when her son's remains were laid to rest in the sarcophagus, remained for an hour almost lifeless without signs of breathing, and was barely revived after the ceremony by the bishops with fans and cold water. No king or prince's passing, even among the most barbarous nations, is said to have been celebrated with such protracted mourning. The funerals of splendid tetrarchs were not accompanied by such displays of grief, nor the anniversary of the death of an emperor celebrated with such doleful songs." End quote. Gallus hints that other nobles may have been fearful that Mieszko would take revenge on them for what they did to his father, but it seems awfully convenient that Władysław had a son, and then very shortly thereafter the person in the way of his son succeeding him died under mysterious circumstances. In fact, around the same time Mieszko was killed off, or died of unknown causes, the other rival to power, Zbigniew, was sent to Germany to lead a clerical life by his father, seeming to cement the idea that Władysław was looking to make the transition from his rule to that of Bolesław's smooth and easy. I'm not saying Władysław killed Mieszko, but it does seem that Władysław was concerned that no one opposed his son when the time came for him to rule. Unfortunately for Władysław, at the same time his son Bolesław was born, Judith seems to have died. It's not completely clear if it was the result of the childbirth itself or was just around the same time period, but Władysław was a widower, left in charge of his son. Fear not, though, for Władysław would not remain unmarried for long. Indeed, as part of his embrace of the empire, Władysław would get married to another woman named Judith, this time Judith of Swabia. Now, as an aside, even though Judith of Swabia doesn't have the best reputation and is painted in the archetype of the power-hungry stepmother, you do have to feel sorry for her. She was the daughter of Henry III, the Holy Roman Empire, and was originally engaged to be married to a French prince. Then, plans and political needs shifted, and she was married off to King Solomon of Hungary. Then King Solomon died and she was remarried, this time to Władysław. It's really tough out there for a medieval German princess queen. While we're on the subject of introducing power-hungry people in Poland, let's make note of a most interesting character in Polish history, Sieciech. Sieciech is variously described as the, quote, power behind the throne, as the, quote, closest advisor of Władysław, and, quote, as a wise, noble, and handsome man. But, as we'll see shortly, he was also much decried by his contemporary, Gallus. In Gallus's words, quote, blinded by greed, he perpetrated many cruel and intolerable deeds. He would sell people into servitude on the slightest pretext, drive others from their country, and promote non-nobles over the nobility, so that many of their free will fled their country while not guilty, for they feared that if they didn't, they would soon suffer from his cruelty. End quote. What we know of Sieciech isn't much, which is unfortunate since he's about to become a very pivotal character in the life of Władysław, Bolesław, and the next decade. He was Count Palatine, which was a position seemingly imported from the empire. He was the chief military commander under the authority of Władysław, and he undertook a number of successful campaigns. He was also, importantly, a very shrewd political player who vied for influence and power seemingly above all else. That being said, there is a strong bias against him in the sources we do have. Gallus is the chief source, but then again, Gallus was contemporary with Sieciech, and the people he relied on as sources could very well have been political enemies of Sieciech. At the same time, it seems unlikely that Gallus would have been able to paint an entirely inaccurate portrait of the events we're about to witness. So in my view, you take Gallus at face value, but take some of his descriptive words as unflattering gossip. The story with Sieciech really picks up in the year 1090, with a war with the people of Pomerania. This region, as you'll recall, has been in an on-again, off-again relationship with Poland, sometimes under its sway, sometimes breaking away and doing its own thing. It definitely wasn't fully Christianized yet, and it seemed to want to stay that way. So, in 1090, doing what all good medieval rulers do, Władysław and Sieciech invaded Pomerania and took power. As Gallus tells us, quote, after their defeat, he, Władysław, forcibly seized their cities and towns both inland and along the coast, and installed his retainers and counts in the more important and better fortified places. And since he desired to remove from the perfidious pagans all spirit to revolt, he ordered his officers to burn down on a certain day at an agreed hour all the fortresses in their land. And so it was done. End quote. Yay! Pomerania is conquered and all of their fortresses are destroyed. Not so fast. Gallus goes on to tell us that, quote, even with this, it proved impossible to wholly tame this rebel race. For of those whom Sieciech, the military commander at the time, set over them, some were murdered for their abuses, while the better sort who had behaved with discretion and honor barely managed to escape with the connivance of friends. End quote. So, the Pomeranians rebel and kill some of Władysław's representatives in the region. Being a wise ruler, Władysław can't let this challenge to his authority go unchecked, so he responds with force. As Gallus recounts to us, quote, Duke Władysław did not forget the injury done to his representatives. He marched into their land with a strong force before Lent, and spent there most of the time of the fast. Then, once the better part of the fast was past, he invaded by surprise the richer and more populous heartland, and collected enormous quantities of booty from it, and captives beyond counting. As he was returning home, quite unsuspectingly with his plunder, and feeling safe as he was approaching the boundaries of his kingdom, the Pomeranians, who had been trailing him, suddenly fell upon him by the river Wda, on the day before Palm Sunday. The battle was grievous and bloody for both sides, for it began about the 3rd hour of the day, and only ended as twilight fell that evening. Finally, at night, the Pomeranians escaped under the cloak of the darkness, and the Poles had possession of the battlefield, which was called Dżu, for it hung in doubt whether the Christians or the pagans were smitten there. End quote. Continuing on, Gallus tells us after this defeat, Władysław invaded Pomerania again after calling up some reinforcements from Bohemia. They invaded and began to lay siege to the castle of Nakwu, but were apparently unable to conquer the fortress. At one point, their siege engines were destroyed by the residents of the fortress. The Poles then retreated, leaving the Pomeranians with victory in the field. As Gallus tells us, after this event, quote, the Pomeranians little by little grew lofty in pride against Poland. We'll get back to the Pomeranians later on, but first we need to deal with what will be the first of many rebellions and schisms in the Piast dynasty in the years to come. As we mentioned previously, Władysław had a son with a woman he was unmarried to, named Zbigniew. Now, Władysław had no intention of giving his lands, inheritance, or titles to Zbigniew, which Zbigniew knew full well. He likely also knew that when his father was dead, whoever took his place would have him killed off, since no one wants a potential successor just lurking around in the shadows. That's just a recipe for palace intrigue. That turned out to be a just concern, as Zbigniew would end up setting off years of turmoil regarding the succession following Władysław. We know from Gallus that Zbigniew had been sent to learn in Krakow, and then had been sent even further away to study in a convent in Saxony. Undoubtedly, this was to keep him away from the levers of power. Staying away was not to be Zbigniew's destiny, however, as he was just too central to the Piast family at this moment in time. As I mentioned earlier, Sieciech had been ruling with what appears to have been an iron fist, leading many nobles to flee the country. Many of them ended up in Bohemia at the invitation of the Duke of Bohemia, Władysław II. Władysław was pretty ticked off at Władysław, as Władysław had recently stopped paying tribute to Bohemia for the lands of Silesia. So, Władysław had invited the nobles there with the intention of turning them against Władysław and Sieciech. Gallus tells us that these nobles were convinced to bring Zbigniew over to their side, and the Bohemians were all too willing to go to the convent in Saxony at which Zbigniew was studying to abduct him. After they had all been gathered in Bohemia, the group of exiled Poles began to plot. Their chief goal was to usurp Sieciech's authority, not to overthrow Władysław. With this in mind, they sent letters to a noble named Magnus in Wrocław, the capital of Silesia. They reminded him that even though he should have been ruling over the territory due to his position, in reality Sieciech had installed other men loyal to him to rule over Silesia. Magnus had the title, but none of the power. There were two goals to this letter. On the part of the Polish exiles, they wanted to get Magnus to accept Zbigniew and become a staging point for the rebellion. On the part of Władysław of Bohemia, he was just stirring embers, hoping to gain an advantage over his rivals in Poland. After Magnus received the letter, he, quote, first hesitated for a long while, but when he consulted with the elders and they approved the plan, he acquiesced to the proposal and received the boy. Gallus then goes on to tell us that while Władysław was upset about this, the stronger reaction came from Sieciech and Władysław's wife, who were apparently afraid at what this rebellion could mean for their respective roles. We then find out from Gallus that, quote, consequently, they sent an emissary to Magnus and the magnates of the Wrocław region, demanding to know what they were about in harboring Zbigniew, as well as the exiles, without his father's orders. Did they intend to be rebels or to obey him? To this, those in Wrocław unanimously replied that they had not surrendered their country to the Bohemians or to foreign nations, but had received the lord the duke's son and the fugitives with him, and that they would obey faithfully their lord the duke and his legitimate son Bolesław in all matters and circumstances. But they would oppose Sieciech and his evil deeds by all means possible. End quote. Evidently, Władysław and Sieciech were not pleased with this response. So displeased that they decided enough was enough, they were going to wage war against this upstart rebel and answer the succession question once and for all. Well, they didn't answer that question once and for all, but that is the topic for next time. We'll pick up with this rebellion and set the foundation for what will come to be the reign of Bolesław III. As always, thank you to those who have been supporting the program on Patreon. Your help has been bringing in some new books and opening up opportunities for better research, so it's much appreciated, not just by me, but I'm sure by everyone listening. In what may become a tradition, I'd like to thank some of you by name. Phyllis, Chris, Martin, Wojciech, Christina, Joseph, Colin, Pavel, Vasov, Jillian, Rasmus, Andres, T.E., Christopher, Keaton, and Dylan. Thank you. I'll see you next week.